I'm very disappointing because I didn't really have a career plan in mind when I was growing up. I didn't want to be an exciting airline pilot or jet pilot or anything like that. But I grew up in South Wales, in a town called Newport, which is to the east of Cardiff. And it was a lovely area because it was very beautiful countryside, but also there were Iron Age hill forts, there was a Roman town, a Roman fortress which had been excavated, and there were lots of Norman castles. So I became very interested in archaeology and history. So I think my default interest was in that type of aspect of history. And I went to Leicester as a student. So I went to Leicester University from 1969 to 1972. And I went to do sciences, and I moved away from, if you like, the pure sciences towards very much concentrating on geology and archaeology. So I pursued those childhood interests in getting that type of background. And Leicester was very good as a university. It's obviously great for museum studies, but it was very good for those sciences. The geology department particularly was very good in instructing its students in being methodical and understanding how to care for the collections that were in the department. After I finished my first degree, I took a year out and I worked in a library, which by chance was a medical library in Cardiff. And I was thinking that I would get a career in libraries, but very much on the research side, university libraries, and very much dealing with the management of the collections. While I was working, as with museum studies, there were a few universities where you could study librarianship, or more specifically information management, and City University was one of those. So I applied for and got a post to do a master's at City University on their then very new, very innovative information science course. And that was where I became much more interested in the management of information, the sorts of things that we now take for granted, but which at that point, almost before computers were accessible, was very much in its infancy. On the course we use things like punch cards as means of storing information. My involvement with museums very much began while I was doing that course. So, as I mentioned, I had a background in geology and archaeology, and by chance, while I was doing the course, I was getting a research or student grant. I was getting a student grant, and the same organisation that was giving that grant gave a grant to the Sedgwick Museum in Cambridge to begin to develop the work which became known as the Ergomark Project. I joined it in 1974. I was doing the degree, which, as with your degree, would have finished in the August, September. The project director was John Cutbill, who was primarily interested in the computer systems and the development of software. He appointed 3 research assistants, one of whom was Martin Porter, who had a doctorate in computing from the Cambridge Computer Department, and he was already very familiar with the development of computer systems to store and process complex information. So Martin came on board as the lead programmer. The second research assistant was Richard Light, who was appointed to support Martin and also concentrate on the cataloguing of the Sedgwick Museum collection. And Richard had a team of assistants to do data entry, to do the interpretation of the information from the Sedgwick Museum catalogue so that could be computerised. And then I was the third person who was appointed, and my role was to develop the standards with museums across the country so that we could produce consistent records from different subject areas, and museums could apply those standards within their own internal local practices. The first thing I did in pursuing the project was, as I said, I was appointed while doing a master's degree, and I was asked for my dissertation to do something relevant to the project. So I was actually employed while doing the degree. So I did my dissertation on proposals for a survey of museum cataloguing practice, which at that point hadn't been done. So over the 3 months of the summer in 1974, I visited museums to become more familiar with how they worked. But on my part, once the project had started, once I joined the team, my role was to talk or work with people like Geoffrey Lewis and at that point Geoffrey was the director at Liverpool Museum. He hadn't yet moved to being with the Museum Studies Department at Leicester. And on his team at Liverpool, there was a person called Pat Sudbury, who was Geoffrey's deputy. And Pat was very helpful in giving me access to museum curators around the country who were interested in helping the project and who gave their subject expertise to essentially say, this is what we think should be recorded for a painting or an archaeological object or a social history object or a geological specimen. So for these different subject areas, we got together small groups of people and we negotiated with them to identify what should be recorded. At the end of the 3 years, we achieved a series of results. The first was that the computer software work had gone forward and a computer package called GOS, G-O-S, which is a short form of Goshawk. A computer package called GOS was developed, which could be made available to museums if they had computers. And at that point, of course, very few museums did have computers. The British Museum did, 1 or 2 other university museums did, but very few museums had computers. So the software was developed and was available for further development. Secondly, we developed the standards. So we had produced a museum documentation standard, which was the consensus from these different groups about what should be recorded across the different subject areas that we'd looked at. So there were core fields, such as acquisition information, and then there were specific fields only appropriate to individual subjects. And the next thing we'd done was to produce a series of catalogue cards based on that standard. So for each of these subject areas that we'd looked at, we designed an A3 catalogue card. I suppose the final thing in terms of raising awareness, we had begun to talk with museums about how the standards would be adopted, what new skills would be needed within museums. And I think we had overall raised the perception that documentation was a core competence and a key priority within museums, where up to that point, for many museums, it had been one of the things that was done by a general curator alongside all the other pressures on their time. The MDA, or the Museum Documentation Association, was the natural successor to the Ergomark Project at the Sedgwick Museum. So the way it came about was, as the research funding was coming to an end, Geoffrey Lewis led a campaign really with both national museums and local museums to see whether there could be a long-term continuity for the ideas that were coming out from the project, both the computer software ideas and the ways of working and the standards and the record cards. So there was a strong wish that that portfolio of results was maintained and developed. So within a very short period, within a matter of months, the Ergomark project was able
to change into being the Museum Documentation Association. By that point, John Cupwell had left. He had gone to the National Maritime Museum to lead their computerization project. So Martin Porter, the programmer, at that point was the lead person, was the director of the project. So he and Richard Light and myself and the one or two support staff switched from being on the project team to being employees of the NDA. And we physically switched from being in the centre of Cambridge at the Sedgwick Museum to being at Duxford Airfield. And Duxford is the airfield run by the Imperial War Museum. Well, within the NDA, in a way, it was a very exciting time because there were lots of new opportunities. We were encouraging museums across the country to use these new standards and in practice to use the record cards, the catalogue cards. So a lot of the work was raising awareness and promoting the standards. And then on the other side, Richard and Martin particularly were very much continuing to develop the computer software. In the period between 1977, when it was set up, and 1991, a number of additional staff had come on board and had been particularly concerned with the training and support role. But by 1991, the NDA was beginning to change its role, and there was a new director, and both Richard and I and the third person at that point, somebody called Stuart Home, we all left the NDA at that point. Through the 1980s, we began to move beyond cataloguing to appreciating that it was important to understand the procedures that museums followed when managing their collections. So we began to develop procedural standards, which incorporated the cataloguing requirements within them, but gave a more overall view of the procedures that museums should follow. I did the early part of that work, and then the NDA continued it after I'd left, and staff such as Alice Grant were appointed, and it became known as the Spectrum Standard. So Spectrum is a combination of both a procedural standard and also the cataloguing concepts that come out from that procedural work. So I think it was a significant change or strengthening of the approach to go beyond cataloguing towards the procedures that the cataloguing was part of. So I left the NDA and spent a couple of years as a consultant, including continuing to develop these standards for the NDA. And then in the early 1990s, quite a number of museums were beginning to look to strengthen their documentation staff. And there was the beginning of a change of staff roles within museums, so-called role specialisation. The Museum of London, as one example, set up a new registrar position and a new documentation officer position, and I went to work for them as the documentation officer. So in addition to my own post, a registrar was appointed at the same time. And before I left, I stopped working in 2004, 9 years ago. Before I left, we had established a new department, Department of Information Resources, and I was then heading that department. Well, I stopped working, so I've become very involved in local activities. We live on the south side of Cambridge in what was originally a separate village called Trumpington, and I'm the secretary of the Residents Association, and I'm also on the committee for the local history group. I'm very much interested in how museums can continue this process of improving their own records, making those records available, but how then the end user can draw those records from different disparate sources and put them together for their own purposes and produce new products, new resources, which are a combination from those different individual institutions. So I'm very much hoping that not so much that users can contribute new content, but very much that users can benefit from content and combine it in new ways, but very much depending upon the museums as being the experts that hold the information and maintain it and allow access to it. What I would, I suppose, most wish for aspiring professionals is that organisations, governments in this country and overseas continue to invest in museums and don't cut back excessively, and so that there are sufficient openings for students to come into the profession and to develop in the profession, because without a strong, cohort of people working in museums, we're at such risk of losing knowledge. We will impoverish society if museums don't continue to develop and don't have good expert staff who can properly catalogue their collections and make those collections accessible. It's really, I think, an obligation on society that museums and archives and libraries are properly supported into the future.